I was born and raised in Mississippi in a little town where life was slow and neighbors cared for each other, but nothing in all my years prepared me for the day I lost my husband James without a chance to say goodbye. He was the love of my life, the steady hand that guided me through more than 50 years of marriage. And when he slipped away in his sleep that summer night, I felt like half of me had been torn away. James was a quiet man, never one for fancy words, but his love showed in the small things. He was the kind who brewed my coffee before I woke, who made sure the porch steps were sturdy, who held my hand when we crossed the street. He never needed to say big speeches because his actions told me everything, and I believed there would always be another morning with him beside me. For a while he started feeling tired more than usual, but he just waved it off, saying, "Don't you worry, Mary, it's nothing." I wanted him to see a doctor, but he was stubborn, proud in his way. So I prayed instead, hoping God would give us more time together. That evening before he passed, the air was warm and sweet with honeysuckle, and the cicadas were singing. We sat outside on the porch, like we always did after supper, and he held my hand while talking about the old days, about the children when they were small, about the farm and the simple life we had built together. I never knew it would be the last evening we would share. Later that night, before we went to bed, he kissed my forehead and whispered, "Good night, Mary," just like he had done thousands of nights before. I thought I would hear his voice in the morning, but when the sun rose, James didn't wake up. He had slipped away so quietly, so gently, that I didn't even know he was gone until I touched him and realized he wasn't breathing. I shook him. I called his name. I begged him not to leave me, but he was already gone. My tears fell on his face as I clutched his hand and whispered, "Please, not yet, not like this." But the silence answered me. That morning the house felt strange, too quiet, too heavy. The coffee pot sat cold, his side of the bed empty, his glasses still resting on the nightstand. Neighbors came by with food and kind words. My children tried to comfort me, but nothing filled the emptiness. Everyone told me he went peacefully, that he was in a better place, but all I could think was that I didn't get to say goodbye. I didn't get to tell him one more time how much I loved him. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying our last evening together, wondering if he had known he was leaving. Did he keep it to himself to spare my heart? Did he whisper a goodbye in his soul that I just couldn't hear? The hardest part was not just losing him, but losing him without warning, without those final words, without holding him close one last time. And so I began my days of grief, learning how to breathe in a house that still smelled of him, learning how to carry on in the silence, learning how to live when the person who made life worth living was no longer by my side. After James passed, the days that followed felt like a blur, as though I was walking through thick fog that would not lift. And I remember thinking that time itself had turned cruel because each hour stretched on longer than the last, and yet everything was moving too fast for me to catch my breath. The funeral came quicker than I could process, and people filled the house with casseroles, cakes, and kind words. But when the last guest left and the doors closed, the silence returned heavier than ever. I wandered from room to room, touching his things, his jacket hanging on the back of the chair, his hat resting by the door, his boots still holding the shape of his feet, and every corner whispered his name. I would find myself reaching out as though he might suddenly appear and take my hand, but the air was always empty. Nights were the hardest, because James had always been beside me, his steady breathing like a lullaby that soothed me to sleep, and now I lay in the dark with nothing but the sound of my own heart pounding. I would roll over, expecting to see the outline of his shoulders in the moonlight, but the pillow was cold and untouched. Sometimes I whispered into the dark, "Good night, James," hoping that somehow he could still hear me. My children tried to be strong for me. They came around more often in those first weeks, bringing groceries, checking on the house, and making sure I ate, but even surrounded by family, I felt alone. They had their own lives, their own families, their own pain to carry, and I could see in their eyes that they too were grieving, though they tried not to show it. My daughter would hug me a little longer than usual, and my son would fix things around the house without being asked, and I knew it was their way of saying they loved me. But once the day ended and they drove back to their homes, I was left sitting in that big empty house. The clock ticked louder than before. The creak of the floorboards echoed more sharply, and the stillness pressed down on me until I could hardly breathe. I thought about that last night again and again. I replayed it in my mind until the memories felt sharper than real life. We had sat under the stars, his hand wrapped around mine, and I tried to remember every word he said, every pause in his voice. I told myself maybe he knew he was leaving, and that was his way of saying goodbye, but the truth was I still longed for something more. I wanted to hold him in my arms, to look into his eyes, to tell him not to be afraid and that I would be all right. The suddenness of it all left me with questions that had no answers, and those questions kept me awake through the nights. Sometimes I thought I heard his footsteps in the hall, or the sound of him clearing his throat in the kitchen. But it was just the old house settling, playing tricks on a lonely widow. The neighbors continued to check on me, good-hearted people bringing pies or offering to help with chores, and I was grateful, but there was a part of me that wanted them all to leave me alone with my sorrow. It was like a wound that needed quiet to heal, but instead everyone wanted to cover it with cheerful words. They would say, "He's in a better place now," and I would nod politely, but inside I wanted to cry out, his better place was here with me. Nights turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months, and still I woke up every morning reaching for him before remembering he was gone. I tried to keep myself busy, working in the garden, folding laundry that only belonged to me now, cooking meals that felt too large for one person. I found myself cooking his favorite dishes out of habit, biscuits with sausage, gravy, fried catfish, cornbread, and then staring at the extra plate I had set at the table before realizing there was no one to eat it. More often than not, I ate standing by the sink because sitting at the table alone felt unbearable. Even the small things reminded me of him. The way the wind rattled the barn door, the sight of the rocking chair he had always sat in, the tools he left scattered in the shed. Everywhere I turned, James was there, and yet nowhere at all. There were moments when grief turned into anger, though I tried not to admit it to myself. I was angry at him for being so stubborn, for brushing off his sickness, for not letting me take him to the doctor, for not fighting harder to stay. Then I would feel guilty for those thoughts, because I knew it wasn't his choice, not really, and I would cry until I had no tears left. Losing him without goodbye made the anger sharper, because it felt like the story of our love had been cut short, the last chapter missing. I didn't get to hear his last words or see his last smile, and I carried that weight like a stone in my chest. At night, I turned to prayer, asking God for strength, asking him to let James know how much I loved him, asking for just a dream where I could see his face and hear his voice again. Sometimes I dreamed of him standing in the doorway, looking young and strong like the day we married, and in those dreams he smiled at me with that gentle smile of his. I would wake with tears on my face, both comforted and broken, wishing I could close my eyes and never leave that dream. The days rolled on, and little by little, I began to understand that grief is not something you finish, but something you learn to carry. It doesn't go away, it just changes shape. Some mornings, I managed to get out of bed without crying, and I counted that as a small victory. Other mornings, I broke down at the sight of his toothbrush still in the holder. I started writing letters to him in a notebook, pouring out all the words I never got to say. I told him about the weather, about the children, about how empty the house felt without him. And though I knew he would never read them, writing made me feel a little less alone. Life after losing James was not life as I knew it, but slowly I began to find a way through the fog. I still missed him with every breath, but I held on to the memories we built together, and I reminded myself that love like ours doesn't end with death. It lingers in the small things, in the morning light, in the laughter of our grandchildren, in the quiet evenings when I still talk to him out loud. He didn't say goodbye, but maybe in his silence there was a message too, that love does not always need words, and that even when we can't hold someone's hand, their presence remains in our hearts. As the months went by, I slowly began to see that grief changes a person in ways you never expect, and though the house still felt empty and the nights still stretched on without rest, there were little sparks of life that reminded me I was still here, still breathing, still carrying the love James and I had shared. In the beginning, I thought I would never be able to smile again, but life has a way of nudging you forward even when you drag your feet. One morning, I walked out to the garden, the one James and I had tended together for so many years, and I saw a row of roses blooming brighter than I had ever seen before. James had planted those roses for me on our 30th anniversary, and every year he would prune them carefully, making sure they grew strong. Standing there alone, I could almost see him crouched down with his shears, whistling as he worked, and though the memory brought tears to my eyes, it also brought a strange kind of peace. It was as if those roses were saying, "I'm still here, Mary, don't give up." I began spending more time outside, pulling weeds, watering the flowers, and tending to the vegetables we had once grown side by side. At first it hurt, because every corner of that garden reminded me of him, but then it started to feel like he was there with me, guiding my hands, steadying me when I felt weak. The earth has a way of healing broken hearts if you let it, and slowly the garden became my refuge, a place where I could talk to James in the silence, a place where my tears could fall into the soil and no one would see. The children visited often, and though I still felt lonely after they left, I cherished the time we had together. My daughter brought the grandchildren, their laughter filling the house like sunlight through dusty windows. They would run down the hall, their feet pounding on the floorboards, and for a moment the house didn't feel empty at all. I would sit in James's old chair and watch them play, remembering how he used to sit there too, a quiet smile on his face as he watched the little ones. My son took me to church every Sunday, making sure I didn't feel alone, and though sitting in that pew without James by my side felt strange, I found comfort in the hymns, in the familiar voices rising together, in the thought that maybe James was listening too from somewhere beyond. There were still hard days, of course, days when I couldn't get out of bed, days when the weight of silence pressed so heavily on my chest that I thought it might crush me. I would find myself reaching for his sweater just to breathe in the faint smell of him that still lingered. At night, when the loneliness was sharpest, I sometimes walked through the house turning on every light just to chase away the shadows. Grief is not neat or tidy. It comes in waves, sometimes gentle, sometimes fierce, and you never know which kind of wave will hit you when you wake up in the morning. But I learned to let the waves wash over me instead of fighting them, because fighting only left me more tired. What surprised me most was how much comfort I found in remembering the simple things about James. Not the big milestones, not the anniversaries or the birthdays, but the small habits that made up our life together. The way he always whistled off-key when he was fixing something. The way he folded his napkin so neatly at the end of every meal. The way he called me Mary Girl, even when my hair had turned silver. Those little things kept him alive in my heart, and I realized that love is not measured in goodbyes or last words, but in the thousands of quiet moments we shared without thinking much of them at the time. Sometimes I sat on the porch in the evening, just as we had done together for so many years, and I would talk to him. I told him about the children, about the weather, about the day I had. I knew people might think I was silly, talking to someone who was no longer there, but it comforted me. The breeze would rustle the magnolia leaves, and I would imagine it was his way of answering me. Maybe it was only the wind, but maybe, just maybe, it was more. As time went on, I found myself looking for signs of him everywhere. Some days it was a red cardinal perched on the fence, staring at me as if it knew me. Other days it was a song on the radio, one of those old country tunes we used to dance to in the kitchen. Once, I even found a note tucked inside one of his old books, a scrap of paper where he had written a reminder to fix the fence, and though it was nothing more than a to-do list, seeing his handwriting again made me cry and smile at the same time. People say those we love never truly leave us, and I started to believe it. James may have died without saying goodbye, but his presence lingered in ways I couldn't explain. One evening I sat outside watching the sunset, the sky painted in shades of pink and orange, and I thought about how James and I had lived a life full of love, even if it ended sooner than I wanted. I realized then that maybe he didn't need to say goodbye, because our love was not ending, only changing. He had given me 50 years of devotion, kindness, and partnership, and perhaps his silence in the end was not an absence, but a reminder that love is beyond words. That night, for the first time in many months, I closed my eyes and felt a little lighter. The pain was still there, and I knew it always would be, but mixed with the pain was gratitude for the years we had, for the memories that remained, for the love that even death could not take away. When I look back now, I realize that the memories of our younger years have become my greatest treasures, and sometimes when the grief feels heavy, I close my eyes and let my heart wander back to those days when James and I were just beginning our life together. I was only 19 when I first met him, full of dreams but still unsure of where life would lead me. He was already a man of steady hands and steady eyes, a little older than me, with a kind of calmness that made me feel safe the moment he looked my way. He drove an old blue truck, the kind that rattled and smoked but never let him down, and I remember the way my heart skipped whenever I saw it coming down the dirt road. My daddy used to laugh and say, "Mary, you better get your chores done before you wear a hole in that window staring out for that boy." And he was right, because I was always watching, always waiting for James. Our courtship was simple, as things were back then. We went to church together on Sundays. We shared milkshakes at the little diner on Main Street. We walked down country roads, talking about everything and nothing. James wasn't one for fancy words, but when he looked at me, I knew. One evening, under the wide Mississippi sky, he asked me to marry him. He didn't have a ring yet, didn't kneel down or make a big speech. He just held my hand and said, "Mary girl, let's spend our lives together." And I said yes, because I couldn't imagine it any other way. We married young in the small white church where I'd been baptized, and though we didn't have much money, we had each other, and that was more than enough. We built our first home together, a tiny wooden house with creaky floors and thin walls that let in the cold, but to us it was a palace. I still remember the way we laughed trying to paint the kitchen walls, me spilling more paint on the floor than on the wood, James shaking his head with that little grin of his. Those were hard years with long days of work and little money to spare, but they were sweet years too, because every burden felt lighter when shared. As the seasons passed, our love grew like the fields we tended. We welcomed our children one by one, and I watched James transform from a young husband into a devoted father. He worked harder than anyone I knew, often from sunrise to sunset, just to provide for us. And though he came home tired and worn, he always found the energy to lift a child into his lap, to tell them stories, to kiss their foreheads before bed. He was not loud or showy with his love, but his presence filled every corner of our lives. Even in the leanest years, when money was scarce and worries weighed heavy, James's steady nature kept us afloat. He was my anchor in every storm. I remember one winter when the crops failed and we barely had enough to make it through. I was scared, wondering how we would feed our babies, but James looked me in the eyes and said, "We'll get through this, Mary, same as we always do." And we did. He found odd jobs, worked extra hours, mended tools to save money, and somehow, by God's grace, we made it through. That was the kind of man he was. Quietly strong, determined, unwilling to let his family go without. As the children grew older and our hair turned gray, life slowed down, but our love never did. We found joy in the simple routines, sitting on the porch swing at dusk, holding hands during church hymns, sharing coffee in the quiet of morning. Some people spend their whole lives searching for excitement, but I found my happiness in those small, steady moments with James. The world outside might have changed, new roads, new buildings, new faces, but inside our home, love was the same as it had always been. I think that is why losing him the way I did hurt so deeply. After a lifetime of shared moments, I thought we would have one final moment together, one last look, one last touch, one last word. But life doesn't always give us the endings we hope for. Sometimes it takes our loved ones in the stillness of night, leaving us with only memories to cling to. Yet, even in my sorrow, I began to realize how blessed I had been. Some women never know love like that at all, and here I was with 50 years of it woven into the fabric of my life. Sometimes I walk through the rooms of our house and I see ghosts of our past. The spot on the floor where our son took his first steps, the corner where we placed the Christmas tree each year, the table where James and I sat sharing laughter with friends. Each memory is like a thread, and though James is gone, the threads remain, weaving a tapestry that still wraps around me when the nights are cold. I talk to him often, whispering the things I never got to say, and sometimes I imagine his voice answering me, calm and steady as it always was. It still hurts that I never got to hold his hand one last time, never got to hear him say goodbye, but the more I think about it, the more I believe that maybe goodbye was never meant for us. Maybe James slipped away in silence because he knew words weren't necessary. We had lived our love out loud for 50 years, and that spoke louder than any goodbye could. Our life together was the goodbye we didn't need to say because it had already been spoken in every small moment, every laugh, every touch, every prayer shared side by side. Now, when I close my eyes, I see us as we once were, young and full of hope, walking hand in hand down a dirt road in Mississippi, the sun setting behind us, the future stretching out ahead. That memory warms me when the loneliness creeps in, and I hold on to it tightly. Because though death took him from my side, nothing can take away the life we built together, and nothing can take away the love that still lives in my heart. Grief is a strange companion, one I never invited, but one that decided to walk beside me after James left. And in the beginning it felt like an enemy that stole my breath and my strength. But as time went on, I began to see that grief was also a reminder of the love we shared, because you cannot grieve deeply unless you have loved deeply. And so I learned to carry it with me, heavy though it was. In those first months, I thought I would never know peace again. But slowly, quietly, little things began to help me breathe a little easier. My faith became my anchor. And though there were nights when I cried into my pillow asking God why he had taken James so suddenly, there were also mornings when I opened the Bible and felt comfort in words that reminded me I was not truly alone. At church, the hymns that once made me weep began to lift me instead. And I started to imagine James listening to, sitting in a place where pain and sickness no longer reached him. It gave me strength to believe he was whole again, even if I could not see him. I began to notice that healing did not come all at once, but in small moments. It came when the garden bloomed, and I felt James's presence in the roses he had planted. It came when my grandchildren laughed so loudly that the walls shook with joy, and I knew James would have loved to see them. It came when I sat with neighbors on the porch and shared stories about him, turning sorrow into smiles as we remembered his quiet humor, his gentle way of living. At first, I thought speaking of him would hurt too much, but I discovered that keeping his memory alive through stories made him feel close, like he had simply stepped into another room. Still, there were days when the sadness would crash over me without warning. I could be folding laundry and suddenly smell the faint scent of his aftershave on one of his old shirts, and the tears would come as if the wound had opened fresh again. I could be standing at the sink washing dishes and hear a song on the radio that we once danced to in the kitchen, and my knees would go weak. Grief never really leaves you. It just becomes a part of you. And I learned that I had to let myself feel those waves instead of pretending to be strong all the time. Some days I told myself, Mary, it's all right to cry, it's all right to miss him, it's all right to still need him even though he's gone. In those quiet nights when the loneliness felt sharpest, I started writing letters to James in a notebook I kept by my bed. I poured my heart onto those pages, telling him about my days, about the children, about the things I wished I could share with him. Sometimes I wrote of my anger too, because a part of me was still upset that he had been too stubborn to go to the doctor, that he hadn't let me help him, that he slipped away without a word. But by writing it down, I found release, as if the paper could hold my sorrow so I wouldn't have to hold it alone. Those letters became my way of saying all the goodbyes I never got to say, and though I knew James would never read them, somehow I believed he still heard me. I found myself clinging to little signs that he was still near. Once, when I was sitting on the porch crying, a red cardinal landed on the rail beside me and stayed there longer than seemed natural, staring at me with its bright eyes, and I felt in that moment as if James had sent it to remind me he was watching over me. Another time, when I was feeling particularly low, I opened an old photo album and a small pressed flower fell out, one that James must have tucked away years ago, and it felt like a whisper from the past saying, "I'm still here." Some people might call these things coincidences, but I chose to see them as gifts, gentle reminders that love does not die with the body. The hardest part of moving forward was learning how to live as just me instead of as us. For 50 years, every decision, every plan, every moment had been shared, and now I found myself talking out loud just to fill the silence, saying things like, "What do you think, James? Should I plant the tomatoes here or there? Or would you like cornbread with this stew?" I suppose some might think it odd, but it comforted me, and in my heart I imagined his quiet chuckle, his steady voice answering back. In that way, he never truly left me. Little by little, I started to accept that goodbye might not have been necessary after all. At first, it tore me apart that he hadn't spoken to me in those final moments, that I didn't get to hold his hand or hear his last words. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized James had already said everything that mattered in the life we built together. Every morning coffee, every evening prayer, every touch of his hand across the years had been his way of saying, "I love you, Mary." Perhaps when he slipped away in the night, he didn't need to say goodbye because our love was bigger than words, stronger than endings, eternal in its own way. Now, when I walk through the garden, when I sit in church, when I watch the grandchildren grow, I carry him with me. The grief is still there, like a shadow that follows me, but so is the love, shining brighter than the pain. I have learned that the two walk together, sorrow for what I lost, gratitude for what I had. And though the house still feels empty some nights, my heart feels full when I remember all the years we shared. James may have died without saying goodbye, but in every memory, in every quiet moment, in every corner of my heart, he is still speaking, and his message is clear. Love never leaves, not even when life does. With time, I began to realize that while grief would always live inside me, I could not let it keep me frozen, because James would not have wanted me to sit still in sorrow forever. He had lived his life working hard, giving his best and finding joy in the simple things, and I knew deep down that the best way to honor him was to keep living, even if my steps were slow at first. I started small, just doing the ordinary things that had once felt impossible. I cooked myself proper meals instead of just toast or soup, because James always liked to see me eat well. I cleaned the house the way he used to tease me for doing, dusting every corner as though company was on its way. I went outside every morning to tend the garden, talking to the flowers as though they could carry my words up to heaven. At first, I felt like I was only going through the motions, but little by little, those motions began to feel like life again. My family became my reason to push forward. My daughter often brought the grandchildren over, and their laughter echoed through the halls that had grown too quiet since James's passing. I found myself telling them stories about their grandpa, about how he used to whistle off-key when he was working, about the way he built them a tree house out back with nothing but leftover wood and a hammer, about how he never raised his voice but always got his point across with just one look. Their little eyes would grow wide and they would giggle, and I could almost see James smiling at them through me. Sharing those memories felt like keeping him alive, not just for me, but for them too, so they would always know the kind of man he was. I began to help more at church as well, volunteering to bake pies for gatherings, singing softly in the choir even though my voice was weak, and visiting neighbors who were sick or lonely. At first it felt strange, putting myself out there when my heart was still tender, but the more I gave, the more I received in return. One lady told me she admired my strength, and I almost laughed because I didn't feel strong at all. But then I thought, maybe strength doesn't mean not feeling pain. Maybe it means carrying pain and still choosing to live. And that was what I was trying to do. Sometimes in the evenings, I sat on the porch with my knitting, the same place James and I had spent so many nights together, and I watched the sun sink down behind the magnolias. I still spoke to him out loud, telling him about my day, and sometimes I swore I could hear his answer in the rustle of the trees. There was comfort in those moments, comfort in knowing that love does not vanish with death, that it lingers in every memory, every habit, every breath. The nights remain the hardest, but even then I found little ways to soothe myself. I kept his Bible by my bed and read from it when the loneliness grew sharp. I played old hymns softly and let the music carry me into sleep. I even started writing down my memories in a journal, page after page of the life James and I had lived, so that our story would not fade. At first, I wrote only for myself, but then I realized maybe one day my children or grandchildren would read it, and they would know how deep love can run, how even in loss there can be beauty. There were times when grief tried to pull me back, when I caught myself staring too long at his empty chair or clutching his old jacket as though it could bring him back. On those days, I allowed myself to cry, but then I told myself that James would not want me to stop living. He would want me to find joy in the small things we once shared, the blooming of a flower, the laughter of a child, the warmth of the sun on my face. And slowly, I began to notice those things again. I even started attending the county fair with my family, something I thought I would never have the heart to do without him. Walking through the fairgrounds, smelling the fried dough, hearing the music, seeing the children's wide eyes, it all brought back memories of when James and I used to go when we were young. He would always win me a prize at the ring toss, no matter how many tries it took, and I still have a small stuffed bear he once gave me. Holding that memory close, I smiled through the tears, realizing that though he was not there beside me, he was still with me in every step. As the seasons changed, I began to feel a quiet strength growing inside me. The grief was still there, yes, but it no longer drowned me. It became part of me, a shadow to my light, and I learned to carry it with grace. When people asked how I managed, I told them the truth. I kept moving because James loved life too much for me to waste the rest of mine. I kept going because love does not end with death. I kept smiling because I knew one day, in God's time, I would see him again, and until then I wanted to live in a way that would make him proud. I know I will never stop missing him. I know there will always be moments when the ache feels fresh, when I reach for his hand and find only air, when I dream of him and wake up with tears on my cheeks. But I also know that grief is the price of love, and I would pay that price again 1,000 times for the life we shared. James may have left this world without saying goodbye, but I have come to understand that maybe he didn't need to. Maybe our whole life together was his way of saying goodbye, not with words, but with love that still wraps around me even now. As the years have slowly gone by since that morning when James slipped away without a word, I have learned many things about love, loss, and the way the heart keeps going even when it feels shattered. At first, I thought I would never be able to breathe without him, never be able to find my footing in a world that felt so empty, but time has a way of softening sharp edges. The ache never truly leaves, but it becomes something you can carry, like a heavy quilt that keeps you warm even while it weighs you down. I still wake sometimes expecting to hear his footsteps or feel the mattress dip when he climbed into bed. And when I realize again that it's only me, the tears come. But now, instead of drowning me, they wash gently, reminding me that I was blessed to have something worth crying for. Not everyone gets that, and I have come to see my grief as a reflection of the deep love we shared. I spend many of my days remembering him, not with sorrow, but with gratitude. I remember how he loved me through the simplest gestures, how he showed me every day what devotion looked like, how he never let a day pass without holding my hand. I remember the laughter we shared on quiet nights, the way he whistled in the garden, the way he told our children stories with a sparkle in his eyes. These memories, once so painful, now feel like treasures I carry in my pocket, little reminders that life gave me a gift in the form of James. And when I share these stories with my grandchildren, I feel his presence near, as if he is sitting beside me, smiling as he listens. The world has changed so much since he left, but in my heart he remains steady, timeless, untouched by age. Sometimes I wonder what he would think of the way the grandchildren have grown, how proud he would be of the adults our children have become, how his eyes would light up to see the new babies being born into the family. I imagine his smile, his laugh, his gentle way, and though I can't see him, I know he would be full of pride. In that way, he is still guiding us, still shaping our lives, even from the place where he now rests. There are days when I visit his grave, carrying flowers and speaking softly, and though the world around me continues to bustle and move, in those moments time feels still. I tell him all the things I didn't get to say on that morning. He left without goodbye. I tell him how much I love him, how much I miss him, how grateful I am for the years we shared. I tell him about the children and the grandchildren, about the little things in life he would have chuckled over. And when I finish, I sit in silence, listening to the wind in the trees, the rustle of leaves, the song of birds, and in those quiet sounds I feel him answer. It may not be with words, but it is with presence, and that is enough for me. I have come to believe that when he left, he didn't need to say goodbye, because our love was too deep for words, too strong to be contained in a single farewell. Our whole life together was a long conversation, full of laughter and whispers, promises and devotion, and maybe that was his way of leaving me with everything I needed. Goodbye would have felt too final, too sharp, but love, that was ongoing, endless, unbreakable. Love was his goodbye, and love is what I carry still. Sometimes late at night, I still whisper into the darkness, "Good night, James," just as he used to say to me. And though the room is quiet, I believe he hears me. I believe that love stretches beyond the veil between this life and the next, that our souls remain bound no matter how far apart our bodies are. That belief gives me peace. It allows me to face each new day with a little more courage, a little more grace, knowing that my journey here is not yet over, but that when it is, he will be waiting. In the end, my story is not just one of loss, but one of love. Yes, my husband died without saying goodbye, and that absence once felt like the cruelest wound. But in time, I have realized that he left me something far greater than goodbye. He left me a lifetime of love, a legacy of kindness, and a heart forever marked by his presence. That is what I hold on to when the nights are long and the days are lonely. That is what carries me forward, step by step, until the day comes when I no longer walk alone. So if you ask me how I survived, I will tell you this. I survived by remembering, by honoring, by living in the way he would have wanted me to. I survived by leaning on faith, by trusting that love does not die. I survived because James and I built something that could never be broken, not even by death. And though he never said goodbye, I have learned that maybe goodbye was never the point. Maybe love itself was the only word we ever needed. And so I go on with tears sometimes, with smiles often, with hope always, carrying him in my heart, whispering to the wind, waiting for the day when I see him again. And when that day comes, I know he will take my hand in his, and with a smile on his face, he will say the words I long to hear, not goodbye, but welcome home.